Russia's reserves just hit a new all-time high of 600 billion, and the gold component is 20% of that. So over $120 billion in gold, about 2,300 tons. And everyone's like, well, yeah, but the U.S. has 8,000 tons. They only have, maybe a little over a quarter of that, but their economy is only 1/12 the size. So when you look at gold relative to GDP, they have a lot more gold than we do, and they're in a much better position. And part of it is just so U.S. sanctions don't hurt them, because they're not relying on treasury bills or dollar payments to support their reserve position, because they have a lot of gold. And Ukraine is another hot spot. But I always say, Kim, all those things are on the list. I watch all of them. One or more of them may explode, literally or otherwise. But the thing that probably deserves the most attention is the thing that none of us are thinking about, the true unexpected. But even the unexpected, the thing that's not on the list, has warning signs, and that's what I look for.
Thank you. I think we're all connected in there with the debt and all this stuff.
Yeah, well, the $15,000 goal is actually very straightforward. It's not a number I pulled out of the air. It's not a number I made up to, attract attention. You don't really need that. But it is the number that gold would have to be, or higher. I mean, it's a base, but it's the lowest number that gold would have to be if you were going to use gold to support the value of the US dollar. And why is that? Because we know how much gold the United States has, 8,133 tons. I mean, the people like the Vault Support Knox aren't empty, are empty. They're not empty. By the way, most of the gold's not in Fort Knox. It's at West Point. There is a lot in Fort Knox, but more of it's at West Point, the Denver Mint, and a few other locations. They're not empty. The U.S. government could have leased the gold out, and that's fine, but the gold doesn't go anywhere, and you can terminate the leases, and it's still there. So we know what the money supply is. The Fed publishes that. We know how much gold we have. And so if you were going to go on a gold standard, you would basically have to say, well, what's the value of an ounce of gold? Where am I going to set it? Because that's what a gold standard is. Now, by the way, just to be clear, there's not a central banker in the world, with the possible exception of Elvira Nabiullina, who's the head of the Central Bank of Russia. She's the only central banker really stands her job. She's taken gold up to 20%, slightly more than 20% of Russia's reserves. Russia's reserves just hit a new all-time high of 600 billion, and the gold component is 20% of that. So over $120 billion in gold, about 2,300 tons. And everyone's like, well, yeah, but the U.S. has 8,000 tons. They only have, maybe a little over a quarter of that, but their economy is only 1/12 the size. So when you look at gold relative to GDP, they have a lot more gold than we do, and they're in a much better position. And part of it is just so U.S. sanctions don't hurt them, because they're not relying on treasury bills or dollar payments to support their reserve position, because they have a lot of gold. But getting back to the U.S., so if you said, okay, because one of the objections to a gold standard, people go, yeah, well, maybe we had it once upon a time and maybe it worked okay, but we can never go back there because commerce and credit and trade and bank balance sheets are so high, we don't have enough gold to support that level of commerce. We just don't have enough gold. That's nonsense. There's always enough gold. It's just a question of price. Now, at $1,800 an ounce, no. If you say we're going to go on a gold standard at $1,800 an ounce, and here's how much gold we have, you'd have to cut the money supply by about 75%. And that would throw us that would be the Great Depression. That would be, you collapse the economy. You can't do that. By the way, it is the mistake that the UK and Winston Churchill made in 1925 when they went back to a gold standard at the pre-World War I rate. And that was basically overvaluing sterling. So they had to cut the money supply, and they did go into a depression 4 years ahead of the rest of the world. So hopefully lesson learned, although with central bankers, you never know. So if you say, okay, if I want a gold standard, I can't peg it at 1,800 because I'd have to cut the money supply by 3/4 or more. So what's the alternative? Raise the price of gold. So notice the same amount of gold can support any amount of commerce at a higher price. So then the question is just an 8th grade math problem. It's like, okay, well, what would the price have to be to match the money supply? And use M1 as an example. And I assume 40% gold backing, the Austrians and monetarists, they bang the table. No, it has to be 100% or, you're leveraged. Okay, that's a debate for another day. Historically, 20% has worked, so I'll be conservative and say 40%. So if you take 40% of the money supply, and that's how much gold you need by value, and we know the weight, divide one by the other, and you come out to $15,000 an ounce. So the reason I'm explaining that, Robert, is I want to be clear that there's not a central bank in the world who wants a gold standard. They're not going to go to it voluntarily. Correct. But if they have to, because of collapsing confidence in the dollar, then it follows that you have to go to $15,000 an ounce, because any lower valuation is deflationary, and that's the last thing you want.
This national debt just hit 30 trillion. COVID's going to be around. The euro dollar market is bigger. Europe is in trouble. What's the possibility of $15,000 gold?
Well, it gets better every day. So two things. First of all, it's a big number. I look at it, but what I look at, and others do also, is you look at the debt to GDP ratio. Right. The number could be, if you have a bigger economy, 30 trillion might be just fine. But you say, well, what's the ratio of the national debt to the size of the economy? Well, when the debt is 30 trillion, which it is, you're right, it just got there, and the economy is about 22, 23 maybe trillion, that's a debt to GDP ratio of 130% or more. So why is that significant? Well, there's a huge body of economic research. We don't have time to go through it all, but Carmen Reinhart and Ken Rogoff have been the leading scholars, but there are many other studies. You don't have to rely on Reinhart and Rogoff, although you can, but there are many other studies that say the same thing. When the debt to GDP ratio goes over 90%, there's no longer any monetary stimulus. It's a headwind to growth. The Keynesian idea, you borrow $1, spend $1, and get $1.20 of growth, right? Borrow $1, spend $1, get $1.10 of growth. But the number keeps getting smaller. What happens when you borrow $1, spend $1, and you get 80 cents of growth? You didn't even make your dollar back. And so now the debt to GDP ratio is getting worse. That effect is getting worse. You're off the right hand of the diminishing marginal returns curve. You're actually into negative marginal returns. So not only is it not stimulative, calling the Biden thing stimulus is nonsense. Not only is it not stimulative, it's a headwind to growth, number one. Number two, the people say, well, we'll never be able to pay off the national debt, the $30 trillion. You don't have to pay off the national debt, but you do have to roll it over. That's the key. So as an old, a 10-year note that you issued 10 years ago matures this year, you got to pay off that note. Well, maybe you issue a new 10-year note, or maybe you issue a new 30-day bill or a 5-year note or whatever it is. So Treasury securities are maturing all the time, every day. New securities are being issued, at least weekly, sometimes daily, depending on maturity. And that's the system Alexander Hamilton invented in 1789. And it's been going strong for 230 years. But it's always been based on confidence and good management. In U.S. history, and I cover this in chapter 2 of my book, Aftermath, U.S. history shows that, the debt goes up, but it always goes up. The debt to GDP ratio goes up in times of war. And then in times of peace, we pay it back down again. Then it goes up in a war, and then it comes back down again. So you can think of it as dry power. It's almost like, ammunition and gunpowder and artillery, or, today jets or cruise missiles or whatever. You keep your debt to GDP ratio modest so that you can ramp it up when you have to. That's gone, thanks to Stephanie Kelton and Janet Yellen and modern monetary theory and Bernie Sanders and a lot of other influences. That's gone. Now, the debt to GDP ratio is at a very high, historically high wartime level, even higher, but there's no war. What are you going to do if there is a war? Where's your borrowing power then? Or something like the Great Depression, not the technical definition I gave, but, a collapsing economy, where's your borrowing power then? And that's the problem. It's not that you have to pay off the debt. You do have to roll it over. And when you lose confidence, you can't roll it over. Then you lose confidence in the dollar itself.
And that's the issue.
Yes.
That's at issue right now. So my friend, I want to thank you for your ungodly recall and great brain and the ability to just keep going at it. I don't know how you do it.